the morning of the 20th of January, 1842, around 5,000 people gather on Franklin Street in Melbourne to watch two men hanged. It's the first execution this young settlement has ever carried out, and it does not go cleanly. One of the two men strangles slowly at the end of the rope in front of the entire crowd, rather than dying quickly the way a properly performed hanging was meant to. Newspapers cover it as the biggest story of the week. The two men are buried afterward in unmarked graves. Today, that exact spot sits underneath the car park and stalls of the Queen Victoria Market, one of Melbourne's most popular tourist attractions, where most visitors walking through have absolutely no idea what's beneath their feet. The men's names were Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner. Both were Tasmanian Aboriginal men. Both had survived the Black War we've already covered in detail on this show, and both had spent years working as guides for the very colonial protection system that was supposed to be looking after them, before eventually turning against the settlers, expanding into Victoria. Their judge, by his own admission, designed their execution specifically to send a political message to any other Aboriginal person who might be considering resistance. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Wadjuk Nyunga country, and we acknowledge the Wadjuk Nyunga people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner, two Tasmanian resistance fighters who ended up fighting a second colonial frontier on the Australian mainland and became the first people legally executed in the history of Melbourne. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses colonial-era violence in Tasmania and Victoria, a public execution, and the forced separation of Aboriginal families during wartime conditions. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to Tasmania, because to understand why these two men ended up on the Australian mainland fighting British settlers at all, you need to understand what they'd already survived before they ever got there. Tunnerminnerwait was born around 1812 on Robbins Island, off the northwest coast of Tasmania, into the Maulboyheenner clan of the island's North Nation. When he was around 11 years old, he witnessed the Cape Grim massacre, the one we covered in detail in our episode on the Black War, in which Van Diemen's Land Company shepherds shot at least 30 of his own people and threw their bodies off a cliff into the sea. A historian who's researched his life closely has said plainly that Tunnerminnerwait's whole family fell apart as a direct result of what he witnessed that day. Maulboyheenner, born a few years later, around 1816, in the Cape Portland area of northeastern Tasmania, a region his people called Nalabunna, had his own version of exactly the same horror. As a child, he witnessed the wreck of a colonial vessel carrying settlers to establish a new station near his home, and then, in 1829, during the same broader conflict, an armed colonial roving party, led by John Batman, raided his clan, killing a number of people and taking his own mother captive. both men came of age watching the systematic destruction of their communities by exactly the kind of violence this show has already spent a full episode describing. Given that history, it might seem strange that both men ended up working closely with George Augustus Robinson, the same colonial official who ran the so-called friendly missions that eventually relocated Tasmanian Aboriginal survivors to Flinders Island, the man this show has already discussed at length in our Black War episode. But for a young Aboriginal man who'd already watched his community get hunted to the edge of extinction, working as a guide and intermediary for Robinson was, in a brutal kind of way, one of the only paths left that didn't simply end in being shot. Robinson relied heavily on exactly this kind of relationship throughout his career, recruiting Aboriginal people who'd survived the worst of the violence to help him negotiate the surrender of others, a strategy that, whatever Robinson's own private motivations, repeatedly placed survivors in the impossible position of helping manage the same colonial machine that had just destroyed their families. Both Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner spent years in that role from the early 1830s onward, travelling with Robinson, helping negotiate with other Tasmanian Aboriginal groups, and learning English well enough that, by most contemporary accounts, both spoke it fluently enough that Tunnerminnerwait picked up several different names from the colonists around him, including Jack of Cape Grim and the deliberately mocking nickname Jack Napoleon. In 1839, when Robinson was appointed Chief Protector of Aborigines for the newly established colony of Port Phillip on the Australian mainland, he brought 16 Tasmanian Aboriginal people with him to Melbourne, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner among them, alongside Truganini and her husband Waradi. Robinson's stated plan was to use this group to help, in the language of the time, civilize the Aboriginal clans already living around the new settlement. It's a strange, layered piece of colonial logic, using survivors of one frontier war as intermediaries to manage the opening of a second one on a different island for a different set of Aboriginal nations entirely, the Kulin nations whose country Melbourne itself was being built on. It didn't hold together for long. By March of 1841, Tunnerminnerwait had accompanied Robinson on an extended tour through Victoria's Western District, during which they gathered testimony about frontier violence already underway there, including direct investigation into the convincing Ground Massacre, where somewhere between 60 and 200 members of a Gunditj Mara clan had been killed by whalers at Portland Bay only a few years earlier, a story we'll be telling properly on this show before too long. Tunnerminnerwait had now, in the space of little more than a decade, personally witnessed devastating frontier violence against two entirely separate Aboriginal nations on two different sides of Bass Strait, and had spent years working inside the exact colonial system responsible for both. In September of 1841, Tunnerminnerwait, Maulboyheenner, and 3 Tasmanian Aboriginal women, Plorinanupna, known as Fanny, Matapuemina, known as Maria, and Truganini herself, left Robinson's group and struck out on their own. Over the following 7 to 8 weeks, the group waged a sustained campaign against British settlers across the Western Port and South Gippsland districts on Melbourne's outer fringe, stealing firearms and ammunition from settlers' huts near Dandenong, robbing stations across the wider area and wounding 4 white men in the process. 2 men, whalers working near Cape Patterson, named Cook and Yankee, were killed. By most accounts, at least part of what drove the group into this stretch of country was a search for Maria's husband, Lackley, who'd gone missing in the area and was rumoured to have been murdered there himself, adding a layer of personal grief to what's usually remembered purely as an armed uprising. 2 survivors of one genocide taking up arms again, partly out of a desperate hope of finding someone they loved still alive. The group was captured on the 20th of October, 1841, by mounted troopers under a colonial commissioner named Powlett. All 5, the 2 men and the 3 women, were charged with murder and brought before the Supreme Court in Melbourne on the 20th of December that year, in front of Judge John Walpole Willis. Their defence fell to a lawyer named Redmond Barry, who held the formal position of Standing Defence Counsel for Aboriginal people in the colony, a role that, on paper, looked like a meaningful legal protection and, in practice, operated under conditions that made any real defence almost impossible. Barry would go on, decades later, to become one of the most prominent judges in Victorian history, eventually presiding over the trial and execution of the bushranger Ned Kelly, a strange historical bookend to a legal career that began trying to defend Aboriginal resistance fighters under a system that barely let him mount a defence at all. Barry argued directly that the colonial legal system had no real authority to try Aboriginal people at all, people who weren't British subjects and hadn't consented to British law, for actions taken during what amounted to active resistance against an occupying settlement. He also raised serious doubts about how circumstantial much of the evidence against his clients actually was. None of it mattered procedurally in the way it should have, because under the rules of the court at the time, none of the 5 Aboriginal defendants were permitted to give evidence or testify in their own defence at all, a basic legal protection available to any white defendant in the same courtroom. Judge Willis made his own view of the matter plain before the verdict was even delivered, stating outright that he did not wish to see justice administered in a way that let murderers escape it, language that left very little doubt about which way he intended this trial to go. The 3 women were acquitted. Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were found guilty and sentenced to death. Willis was explicit in his own later remarks about what he wanted that sentence to achieve, designing the punishment specifically to inspire terror and deter any other Aboriginal person who might be weighing up armed resistance to colonization. This wasn't simply a judge applying the law as he found it. It was a judge consciously using 2 men's deaths as a piece of political theatre, aimed squarely at every other Aboriginal nation watching Melbourne's expansion unfold in a colony barely 7 years into its own existence at the time. On the 20th of January, 1842, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were taken to a site on Franklin Street, behind what's now the City Baths, since the old Melbourne jail on Russell Street was still under construction at the time and had no gallows of its own yet ready. Around 5,000 people came to watch, in a settlement whose entire population at the time was only a small multiple of that number, meaning a genuinely enormous proportion of colonial Melbourne turned out specifically to witness this. Newspaper reports from the time describe both men maintaining what observers called either apathy or savage indifference in their final days, impossible to read clearly given how little anyone bothered to actually ask them how they felt, or in a language either of them could fully share their answer in. The execution itself was badly mismanaged. Maulboyheenner did not die quickly. Witnesses described him being slowly strangled rather than killed cleanly by the drop, a prolonged, visibly botched death in front of thousands of spectators who'd come expecting a clean spectacle of colonial justice rather than the genuinely horrifying scene that actually unfolded. Both men were buried afterward in unmarked graves at the old Melbourne cemetery. That cemetery no longer exists as a recognisable burial ground. It lies beneath the Queen Victoria Market, which opened on the site decades later and remains, to this day, one of Melbourne's most visited tourist destinations, drawing tens of thousands of shoppers every week across ground that holds the remains of two men executed specifically to terrorise Aboriginal resistance into silence for more than 160 years. That's roughly where this story sat. A brief, grim footnote in early Melbourne's criminal history, rarely connected to the broader, continent-wide story of Aboriginal resistance to colonisation, and rarely taught alongside the Black War history that actually explains how these two men ended up in that courtroom at all. That began to change relatively recently. In 2008, a Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner commemoration committee was established specifically to hold an annual remembrance at the site of their execution, work that continues every January to this day, including a separate community ceremony held annually near Cape Patterson, where they were originally captured, organised in recent years by the Base Coast Reconciliation Network. In 2016, the City of Melbourne commissioned a permanent public artwork from artists Brooke Andrew and Trent Walter called Standing by Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner, installed at the intersection of Victoria and Franklin Streets, close to the actual execution site. The artwork deliberately combines a children's swing, reimagined as something closer to a tomb, alongside native plantings and brightly coloured fixtures, referencing both the Aboriginal and Australian flags, an attempt to hold grief, memory, and a child's ordinary plaything inside the same small, quiet piece of public space, a short walk from one of the busiest produce markets in this country. It's worth remembering too, whose country this all happened on, layered over an already complicated story of Tasmanian survivors fighting on someone else's land. The Kulin Nations, the Woiwurrung, Boonwurrung, and neighbouring peoples whose country Melbourne was built on, were dealing with their own rapid, violent dispossession across these exact same years, a process that gets almost no mention in the official record of this particular case, since the courtroom drama played out entirely around two Tasmanian men and the settlers they'd fought, rather than the traditional owners of the very land the trial was held on. Port Phillip in 1841 was barely 6 years old as a colonial settlement, expanding at a pace that left almost no part of its operation, legal, military, or otherwise, working the way it would have in an older, more established colony like Sydney or Hobart. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. Two men who survived one frontier war as children, only to be recruited into managing the opening stages of a second one. A short, desperate uprising on the outskirts of Melbourne, driven as much by grief and a missing husband as by any grand strategy. A trial where the defendants weren't legally permitted to speak for themselves in front of a judge who openly admitted he wanted their deaths to terrify other Aboriginal people into compliance. A botched public hanging watched by a meaningful fraction of an entire colonial settlement, and 2 unmarked graves sitting for over a century and a half beneath one of this city's busiest, most ordinary public spaces, until a commemoration committee and a piece of public art finally gave 2 names back to a story Melbourne had spent 160 years quietly walking across. There's something particularly bleak about the shape of this one, even compared to a lot of what we've already covered on this show. Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner weren't simply victims of a single sudden act of colonial violence. They were people who had already survived genocide once, who spent years working inside the very system responsible for it, and who were then executed with explicit political intent for finally refusing to keep doing that work quietly. Their story doesn't fit neatly into either of the categories this show usually reaches for: purely a massacre or purely a resistance story with some kind of clear moral victory at the end. It's both, layered on top of each other, on 2 different islands, inside 2 different colonial systems that turned out to be operating from exactly the same playbook the whole time. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a 3 Brothers production. I'll see you next time.